Hi everyone, RT here for another episode of Custer and Wolf Building a Watch Company. Today we're talking about the coolest watch on planet Earth, the watch that won the war. This is our military edition. We make 50 of these a year. They come out on Veterans Day, only 50 a year, only on that day. They sell out in 24 hours. And today we're going to talk about why we make it, why they sell out so quickly, why they're so rare, and why we're all here talking about this. So come along. Starting from the beginning, World War II happened from 1939 to 1945. A lot of people ask us when they see our watches, what is old and what is new? What is original and what is modern? And when we talk about the military edition and these pocket watches, I have a bunch on the desk in front of me, and different companies made different watches. But the U.S. Army Air Corps commissioned these watches. They were called the AN 5740. And they were commissioned by the U.S. government for the Army Air Corps, which later became the Air Force, and several other branches of the military. But this pocket watch that we're talking about today was flown on most of the B bombers in World War II. It was called the Master Navigator's watch. And inside of the wristwatch that I have on my wrist, everything inside is old, everything outside is new. And when I say old, these were manufactured between 1941 and 1950. The AN 5740 is what it was called. The government commissioned all the watch companies of the time. We call them the Great American Watch Companies. And they said, can you make us the most accurate timepiece possible for the navigators on the bombers? And again, this is 1941. We did not have GPS. We did not have technology. The only way to tell time when you're in the sky on a bomber aircraft is with this timepiece, with this pocket watch. And there's a lot to unpack around the history of how they were made and all that kind of stuff. But 3 companies answered that call from the government: Hamilton, Elgin, and Waltham. Hamilton ended up getting the majority of the contract. These were military contracts. And the watch companies manufactured these mechanisms for the military, specifically for the Air Corps, just to give you an idea on the rarity of these things. Hamilton made roughly 120,000 pocket watches for that contract between roughly 1941 and 1950. Elgin made about 20,000 and Waltham made about 4,000. And that's what was manufactured, again, in the early 1940s. That's definitely not what exists today. They all had to have GCT on the dial. They had to have a 24-hour dial. Most of them were black dials like this one. And they basically had to look like this. This was what was commissioned from the military. They had to have certain features, like a hacking feature. When I pull the crown out, it stops the second hand from moving. That's called a hacking feature. And that's so they could also be used as stopwatches. Imagine all of the navigators on the tarmac before the bombers took off. They all probably sat here and lined up their watches, made sure they were all on exactly the same time. They all hit the button and ran to the jets and took off. That's how important these things were. That's how important it was to stay on time. It was the only way we knew where we were navigationally. So there was different features that the different companies made in these watches. Most of what we'll talk about today is the Hamilton version, which they called the Hamilton 4992B. But what all of the companies did was, all of these watch companies, these pocket watch manufacturers, they went and found the best engineering they had, and then they modified it for this military contract. So Hamilton took their what's called the 992B, which was the best railroad pocket watch in existence, and they added an extra bridge on the back. And I have one here. So there's an extra little bridge on the back right there and an extra gear that sticks up out of the movement. And that's what creates that central second hand. Most pocket watches have a second hand that's running down here at 6 o'clock. The central second hand is a feature only seen on these military pocket watches. And they took their 992B railroad pocket watch and added those two features, added a jewel. So all of these are 22 joules instead of 21 joules. And that's what gives that central hacking second hand. So Hamilton used the 992B. Elgin used the BW Raymond, which was their best and most famous pocket watch movement made for the railroads. And then Waltham used the Vanguard. And they all did a very similar thing. They added that extra bridge. They added an extra wheel on the back of the movement so that they would have that original piece of very reliable timekeeping technology in a railroad movement, but now with the features that the military needed. And again, Hamilton made a lot more of them, but that's really the reasoning they put from an engineering standpoint and a business standpoint into how they would solve this military contract. And they needed to do that. They needed to use original engineering from the railroad movements because they needed to move very quickly. World War II happened fairly abruptly, and these companies had to pivot and say, okay, you need the military called us. They need 100,000. They need as many as they can of these movements as quickly as possible. So let's use the railroad movements and upgrade them and alter them. When they were delivered to the military, they came, if I can reach it, they came in one of these boxes. And this one actually says Army Air Force on it, which means that it was made later. So during World War II, it was called the Army Air Corps. It became the Air Force after World War II. But just as an example, the pocket watches were delivered from Hamilton. This was the Hamilton 4992B version in this original box. And we have the box. We have the original case. All of the cases say AN 5740 at the top. All of the contracts from the military. One question we get a lot is this case the original case on that movement? And that's a fantastic question. We actually include the case, the pocket watch case, with our military edition wristwatch. And during the war, it's really interesting, when they took the movement out of the case to service it, there was watchmakers in the field. Those watchmakers did not put the same movement back into the same case. They were doing 10, 20, 30 watches and servicing them and oiling them and cleaning them at the same time. And so they all got mixed up. And so we provide the case that we got now, lots of years later with the watch, but it's very unlikely that steel case was with that movement the entire time. It was most likely serviced during the war or afterwards and put back into just any other case. These cases were standardized for that AN 5740 and typically kept Hamilton to Hamilton, Elgin to Elgin, Waltham to Waltham, but not original. This particular one that I was just holding, it's in its original box. More than likely, that's all original, and this would be extremely valuable in its original box, original case, all of that. That's how they were delivered to the Air Corps, and this is how they were used. So imagine they were flown on the B bombers. This is a B-17 Flying Fortress, a B-29 Super Fortress, one of those. There was dozens of different bombers that the U.S. military had. Inside a bomber aircraft, there were a handful of soldiers, and one of them was called the navigator, and the navigator had a desk. So this contraption was mounted on the navigator's desk, and this piece of steel was made, and it has the original insignias and label from the watch factories. This was made to protect the pocket watch. It was very important. This was one of the most valuable tools the navigator had, just as if not more valuable than the gun. And it's because if your pocket watch was not keeping time, if you were off by a minute, let's say in 24 hours, so you were 1 minute ahead or 1 minute slow, you could be as much as 1 nautical mile in the sky away from where you think you are. And if you want to do more research on that, it's this really fascinating concept of longitude and latitude. And there's a book called Longitude, and it's why we need to know what time it is in order to know where we are. But that's why this was so important, and that's why this case was used to protect it. And this case is really cool. You can close it. You can keep this open so you can see what time it is. You can close it to protect it if you're receiving gunfire. You can open it with this little latch. And inside, and you can see this is very old, but this is a gimbal system. So on a flying fortress, it's not like riding in a modern aircraft. It's shaking. The entire aircraft is shaking all the time. And that vibration could cause issues in timekeeping. And so they put springs all around the movement. And so when I shake this, it just accepts some of that vibration and makes the watch more protected. If we receive gunfire or the plane needs to change altitude very quickly and there's a big vibration, then the watch isn't accepting as much of those forces from the aircraft if it's in this protecting case. And so this case was on the navigator's desk, and that's how they knew what time it was. So most of these movements have GCT right on the dial, and that was part of the contract. GCT stands for Greenwich Civil Time, and that was the centralized European time zone of the time. It was what we call today UTC, or the Coordinated Universal Time. So if you try to change the time on your laptop, it says UCT plus 1 plus 5 plus 8. That is a universal time zone. GCT, back in the late 1930s, early 1940s, was the centralized time zone for Great Britain based on the Royal Observatory and what time it was there. And that was the standardized Allied Forces time zone. And so everything was based on that. And that's why they put GCT on front and center of all of these pocket watch movements. So the numerals on this dial go to 24. And as I move this, I pull the crown out, I can change the time. And as I go around, it's a true 24-hour dial. And as I rotate and as I move, you know, when you wear this wristwatch, sometimes it gets hard to remember. But when you look at 12 o'clock, when it's 12 noon, the hour hand is actually down at where we would think 6 o'clock would be. And they did that as standard military time back then, 24-hour time. It's why when you speak to somebody in the military, they say, 2,200 hours. That is just a much easier, quicker way over radio and over simple communication to tell what time it is instead of AM and PM. And so this is one of the few antique pocket watches that we've ever seen that has a 24-hour dial, and honestly, one of the few true 24-hour dials that exists in the world, even in modern wristwatches.
So can you tell us about the significance of the black dial with the white numerals and what the intention was behind that?
Yes. So what I have here are Hamilton, Elgin, and Waltham examples. And it's pretty cool on the back there, sometimes engraved with the markings. This one says Waltham right on it. But They mostly were black dials because when you're in the sky and if you had a white dial like most railroad pocket watches are, and this one was made for the Navy, and that's why it had a white dial and it mattered a little bit less. But if you had a white dial and you're in an aircraft in the sky and it's sunny, remember the Americans did daylight bombing back then, this white dial could catch the light, and someone looking for your aircraft might see the reflection of that light coming right back at them. It's like when you see a reflection or the sunlight hitting somebody's watch or hitting your phone and it reflects back at you. You didn't want that attention in the sky. You didn't want anyone to know where you were, and that was potentially a giveaway. And that's why they used the black matte finished dials so that it didn't reflect anything. Now, again, the Americans in World War II did mostly daylight bombing. And one of the interesting facts, it's interesting, sad, remember this is war. As Americans, we decided to do daylight bombing throughout Europe. And when we bombed the Nazis in Germany, we flew over during the day. In the middle of the day, they could see our aircraft and they could shoot us down a lot easier. But since it was the daytime, we knew where we were a lot better and we would hit our targets more accurately because we could see the cities underneath us better. The Europeans mostly did nighttime bombing, and that's obviously much less accurate. A lot more women and children were lost in the war because of nighttime bombing, but the soldiers in the sky were better protected because it was the middle of the night and no one could see the aircraft. One of the facts that I've learned is because we bombed during the day and it was easier to see our bomber aircraft in the skies, every time an American soldier, an American B-17 aircraft took off from Great Britain and flew over Germany, you only had a 50% chance of landing safely. And that ties into a question that a lot of people ask is, how many of these pocket watches are even left? If you do that math, every time a bomber took off and you only had 50% of the humans in the sky landing safely, if we started with 120,000 of these manufactured just by Hamilton, well, that's hard math to do. But there aren't as many left. And not everyone made it home. And again, that's war. So we buy these pocket watches from mostly estate auctions, sometimes online auctions, sometimes in-person auctions, sometimes from private collectors that have more than one. This particular one in its original box and packaging and everything was definitely part of an auction because it's very valuable, but we wanted to have it for storytelling just like this. We try to source them with their original cases so that we can tell the whole story and keep the case and keep everything together. Sometimes we just get the movement. So it's the movement, the dial, and the hands. That's what it looks like inside. And sometimes we find them altered. So this particular watch, it says Hamilton on the dial. This was a Hamilton 4992B, but this particular watch, sometime after the war, the black 24-hour dial was removed, and the 12-hour dial, like a railroad watch, was put back on. And the hands were painted. If you look really closely at this one, you can tell they weren't painted very well. But the hands are typically white with the black dials. This one was altered after the war, and we have 10 or 12 of these. And that just goes to show that when people came home from the war, and this is an anecdote, I'm not sure how factual this is, when the navigators came home from the war and they had this pocket watch, this was a tool. It was like their weapon. They kept it. They probably asked to keep it. Some of them might have just kept it regardless because it's a pocket watch and they just kept it on them. And some of them were put in drawers And we found them now 70, 80 years later. And some of them were still used. Some of them were still used in the Air Force after World War II. And some of them were altered for civilian use, like this one with a 24-hour dial. And so to answer the question of how many are left when you factor in, the massive loss of life in aircraft, plus just years, decades and decades of time since World War II, we think 10 to 20,000 or so are left. If there's 10 to 25% of the originals left in the world that we have access to, I think that would be my estimate. And that's why we only make 50 a year, because quite honestly, that's as many as I can find. We're searching everywhere all the time for these. And it's taken us years to create the supply chain system and the awareness to try to get at least 50 of these black dial Hamilton movements that we use every year. And this year we have 15 of these coming. And it literally took me 6 years to find 15. I just found the 16th about a week ago, and we're going to keep that one for spare parts. That's how rare these things are. In everything that Vortic Watch Company does, we like to say we preserve American history one watch at a time. The military edition, this watch that we're talking about, the wristwatches that we sell that house an original AN 5740. That's why I said in the beginning, this is the coolest watch on the face of the earth. It's one of the rarest things we've ever seen. It tells the story of America, of freedom, of our fight for our freedom, and why and how we get to be entrepreneurs. Tyler and I get to build really cool watches that tell stories of history because other people lost their lives fighting for our freedom. So if you're watching this and you served our country, thank you for your service. We really appreciate you. I appreciate you. We give back through this product by a portion of the revenue that's generated from the military edition every year goes to my favorite cause, my friend Sam and the Veterans Watchmaker Initiative in Odessa, Delaware. It's one of the only watchmaking schools in the country. It's watchmaking in general is a dying skill. It's a dying craft. There are not enough watchmakers in the world to service all the watches that we have, much less the Rolexes and Omegas that are floating around everywhere. And the Veterans Watchmaker Initiative is trying to solve that. They teach U.S. military vets how to become watchmakers. And watchmaking is like engineering. It's an extremely valuable thing, but you only need to go to school for 2 years, and you make just as much as engineers. And I know that because I'm an engineer. And I think it's a fantastic, skilled trade that clearly we need more of. And that's why we support the Veterans Watchmaker Initiative through this. And hopefully, over time, enough watchmakers will get trained through that school and other schools that they can help us preserve and restore more of this great American history. So I'm getting a lot of questions about this thing. And this is another way we had to tell time very accurately in the war. And this was an artillery fuse. And these watch companies made pocket watches and, clocks for aircraft, dashboards and things like that. But they also made bomb timers and timing devices for artillery and missiles and all of that. And you could, back in the day when this functioned, you could turn this, change how much time you wanted to be allotted between when you released the artillery and when it went off. And that, again, had to be extremely accurate. And so one other fact that I've learned about World War II and World War I as well, with these antique American pocket watches and the pocket watch manufacturing companies, is that they pivoted during the war to manufacture almost entirely, timekeeping devices and components for the military effort and made almost no civilian wristwatches or pocket watches throughout that time. And that it's actually interesting because everyone asks why did all those pocket watch, what we call the great American watch companies, why did they all go out of business in like the 1950s and 60s? You know, when Hamilton lasted the longest, they lasted until 1969, but most companies went under in the 50s or so. And it's because if you think about World War I, World War II, if these companies were mandated to make mostly military devices, all of their R&D efforts were after that. All of their manufacturing were after that. A lot of their workforce was actually fighting, not building. And what's interesting to me from a business standpoint is that if you do the math, that's about a decade. It's about 10 years worth of R&D and production that was used for military efforts. And then you think today, well, Switzerland is the watchmaking capital of the world. I wonder why. Well, the Swiss were neutral. The Swiss had, after those wars, a decade of R&D ahead of us. And that's where Rolex came out with the automatic winding technology. Omega and Rolex and those big companies came out with all these amazing wristwatches and tiny mechanisms inside those wristwatches that told time better than the American companies could keep up with. And the American companies started to die off. And so some of these companies were actually lost because of the war as well, if you think about it like that. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Custer and Wolf Building a Watch Company. Today was all about the military edition. And you might be asking, how do I learn more? How do I buy this thing? It's really cool. vortecwatches.com/military is where all this information that I went over is going to live. This video and all kinds of other information, images of past watches that we've made will all live there. Again, that's vortecwatches.com/military. And we release the 50-piece limited edition called the Military Edition every year on Veterans Day, which is November 11th. And it comes out and is available to everyone at 12 noon Mountain Time at that exact link, vortecwatches.com/military. Head there anytime and sign up for the waiting list where we send all kinds of emails and more information and how to make sure that you get alerted of the sale going on. And put it on your calendars. November 11th at 12 noon Mountain Time, the Military Edition is coming to you.